In the heart of Chicago's frozen December, Vincent Kane ruled his empire with an iron fist, until the night he dismissed a struggling waitress without a second thought. What he didn't know was that beneath her worn apron and tired eyes, Alice Morgan carried a secret worth billions. One act of cruelty on Christmas Eve would unravel everything he thought he controlled, exposing the truth that power isn't always what it seems. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what part of the world you're listening from. Vincent Kane stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office on Michigan Avenue, watching snowflakes spiral past the glass like falling ash. Below, Chicago stretched out in a grid of lights and shadows, a city that bent to his will. At 42, Vincent had built an empire that operated in the gray spaces between legitimate business and the underworld: nightclubs, real estate, import companies that ask no questions. His tailored charcoal suit fit like armor, his dark hair swept back with precision, his jaw sharp enough to cut glass. When Vincent Kane walked into a room, silence followed. The office smelled of leather and expensive bourbon. A crystal tumbler sat on his mahogany desk, amber liquid catching the light. On the wall behind him hung a painting of the Chicago skyline at dusk, a gift from a city alderman who understood the value of friendship. Vincent's phone buzzed constantly with messages from associates, politicians, and people who needed favors. He answered them all with the same calculated efficiency that had carried him from the South Side streets to this tower. But tonight, something felt different. The weight of December pressed against the windows, and Vincent found himself thinking about his father, a man who died in an alley 20 years ago over a gambling debt. Vincent had sworn then that he'd never be powerless again. Every decision since had been made with that promise in mind. His phone rang. Marcus, his right-hand man, spoke quickly. "Boss, we got a situation at the Velvet Room. One of the waitresses is causing problems." Vincent's expression didn't change. "Handle it. She's refusing to work the Christmas Eve shift tomorrow. Says she needs to be with her kid. I told her we don't do special treatment, but she's pushing back." Vincent set down his glass with deliberate care. The Velvet Room was his flagship nightclub, a place where Chicago's elite came to forget their responsibilities. On Christmas Eve, it would be packed with people desperate to escape their families, and he needed every staff member working. "I'll deal with it myself." 20 minutes later, Vincent walked through the back entrance of the Velvet Room. The club wouldn't open for another hour, but the staff was already preparing, polishing glasses, arranging bottles, testing sound systems. The air smelled of citrus cleaner and the faint ghost of last night's perfume. Vincent moved through the space like a shark through water, his presence causing heads to turn and conversations to die. He found her in the break room, sitting at a scarred table with a cup of coffee. Alice Morgan looked exactly like what she was supposed to be, a single mother barely holding on. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, her uniform pressed but worn at the edges. She had the kind of face that might have been beautiful if exhaustion hadn't carved shadows beneath her eyes. When she looked up and saw Vincent, something flickered across her expression. Not fear, exactly. Something harder to name. "Mr. Kane." She stood, her hands steady despite the tension in her shoulders. "Sit." Vincent pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his movements unhurried. "Marcus tells me you won't work tomorrow night." "I can't." Her voice was quiet but firm. "My daughter, Emma, she's 7. It's Christmas Eve. I promised her I'd be there when she wakes up Christmas morning." Vincent leaned back, studying her. "You know how many people would kill for your job? How many single mothers are out there right now, desperate for steady work?" "I know." Alice met his eyes without flinching. "But some things matter more than money." The statement hung in the air between them. Vincent felt something cold settle in his chest. Not anger, but a kind of recognition he didn't want to acknowledge. His own mother had worked 3 jobs to keep him fed after his father died. He remembered Christmas mornings when she'd stumbled home at dawn, too tired to even take off her coat. He pushed the memory away. Sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. "You're fired." Vincent stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "Clear out your locker. Marcus will have your final check ready in an hour." Alice's face went pale, but she didn't beg. She simply nodded once and looked away. Vincent saw her hands grip the edge of the table, knuckles white, and for a moment, he almost reconsidered. Almost. But Vincent Kane didn't build an empire by being soft. He walked out of the Velvet Room into the December night, where snow was beginning to fall in earnest. The cold bit through his coat, and somewhere in the distance, church bells were ringing. Vincent pulled out his phone and sent a text to Marcus. Find a replacement by tomorrow. As he climbed into his black Mercedes, Vincent caught his reflection in the window, a man who'd won every battle but couldn't remember what he was fighting for. He started the engine and drove into the storm, unaware that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. Behind him, in the break room of the Velvet Room, Alice Morgan sat alone in the fluorescent light. She pulled out her phone and made a call, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. It's me, she said quietly. It's time. Activate the contingency plan. On the other end of the line, in a glass tower in Manhattan, lawyers began moving pieces on a chessboard Vincent Kane didn't even know existed. The snow fell harder, covering Chicago in white, erasing footprints and mistakes alike. But some things, once set in motion, cannot be undone. Christmas morning arrived with brutal cold and crystalline sunlight. Vincent woke in his penthouse to silence. No family, no traditions, just the hum of the city 20 floors below. He made coffee in his state-of-the-art kitchen, the machine hissing and gurgling, filling the empty space with mechanical sound. Through the windows, Chicago looked like a postcard, all white rooftops and church spires. Vincent wondered briefly what Alice Morgan was doing right now, if she was watching her daughter open presents, if she regretted standing up to him. He pushed the thought away and checked his phone. Dozens of messages, Christmas greetings from associates, updates from his various operations, a reminder about a New Year's Eve gala at the Drake Hotel. Nothing that required his immediate attention. Vincent dressed in casual clothes, dark jeans and a black sweater, and decided to drive out to one of his properties in Oak Park. The streets were nearly empty, just a few cars, and the occasional family walking to church. Vincent drove slowly, watching the neighborhoods change from high-rises to brownstones to tree-lined residential blocks. He'd grown up not far from here, in apartments where the heat barely worked, and the walls were thin enough to hear every argument, every moment of desperation. His phone rang. Marcus, sounding tense. Boss, we need to talk. I'm listening. Something weird's happening with the Riverside property, the development deal we had lined up. The investors pulled out this morning. No explanation, just a terse email saying they're no longer interested. Vincent's grip tightened on the steering wheel. The Riverside project was a $50 million mixed-use development, his biggest legitimate venture. He'd spent 2 years courting those investors. Find out why. Already trying. But there's more. I got a call from Tony Chen. You know, our contact at City Hall. He says there's suddenly a lot of interest in our business licenses. Inspectors asking questions. Auditors wanting to review paperwork. A cold feeling spread through Vincent's chest. When did this start? Yesterday. Christmas Eve. Vincent pulled over to the curb, his mind racing. In his world, coincidences didn't exist. Someone was making a move against him, and they'd chosen the holiday to do it, when his attention would be divided, when city offices would be closed, when he'd have fewer resources to respond. Get everyone together, Vincent said. I want a full briefing tonight. Every property, every deal, every person who might have a reason to come at us. On it. Marcus hesitated. Boss, you think this is the Italians? Or maybe the Russians? I don't know, but we're going to find out. Vincent ended the call and sat in his car, watching a family across the street. Father, mother, 2 kids, loading into a minivan, probably heading to grandparents' house. Normal people with normal problems. He'd spent his entire adult life making sure he'd never be vulnerable like that, never be at someone else's mercy. And yet here he was, feeling the first tremors of something he hadn't experienced in years. Uncertainty. He drove to his Oak Park property, a restored Victorian that served as a front for one of his money laundering operations. The house manager, an older woman named Rosa, who'd worked for Vincent for a decade, greeted him at the door with surprise. Mr. Kane, I wasn't expecting you today. Just checking in. Vincent walked through the house, noting the holiday decorations Rosa had put up. A tree in the parlor, garland on the mantel. It looked like a real home, which was the point. Everything running smoothly? Yes, sir. Though, Rosa hesitated. I did have a strange visitor yesterday. A woman, very professional, asking questions about the property ownership. Said she was from a real estate investment firm. What firm? Morgan Holdings. The name meant nothing to Vincent, but he filed it away. What did you tell her? Nothing. I said she'd need to speak with the management company. Rosa studied his face. Is something wrong? No. Vincent forced a smile. Just being careful. He left the house and spent the rest of Christmas Day driving through his empire. The nightclubs, the warehouses, the apartment buildings that generated steady cash flow. Everything looked normal on the surface. But Vincent couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial, that somewhere beneath the ice, cracks were spreading. That evening, he met with his inner circle in the private room of a restaurant he owned in River North. Marcus was there, along with his attorney David Rothstein, his accountant Jennifer Wu, and 3 of his most trusted enforcers. They sat around a table covered with documents and laptops, the remains of dinner pushed aside. "Talk to me," Vincent said. Jennifer spoke first, her voice clipped and professional. "Someone's been buying up debt, small amounts, scattered across different entities, but when I map it out, it all connects to your operations. Loans on properties, lines of credit, vendor contracts. Individually, they're insignificant. Together, they represent leverage. How much leverage? Potentially enough to force foreclosures or trigger default clauses on several major deals." Vincent's jaw tightened. "Who's buying?" "Shell companies mostly, but they all trace back to a parent corporation called Morgan Holdings. It's privately held, very secretive. I can't find much information about the ownership structure." Morgan. The same name Rosa had mentioned. Vincent looked at David. "What are our legal options?" "Limited, until we know what they're planning. If they're just accumulating debt, that's not illegal. But if they start calling in loans or forcing defaults," David spread his hands, "we could be looking at months of litigation, frozen assets, operations grinding to a halt." Marcus leaned forward. "Boss, we could handle this the old way. Find out who's behind Morgan Holdings. Apply some pressure." "No." Vincent's voice was sharp. "Not yet. We don't even know what we're dealing with." But even as he said it, Vincent felt the old instincts rising. The street fighter who'd clawed his way up from nothing, who understood that sometimes violence was the only language people respected. He'd spent years building a veneer of legitimacy, but underneath, he was still the kid from the South Side who knew how to hurt people. The meeting broke up after midnight. Vincent stood at the restaurant window, watching snow fall on the empty street, and thought about power, how quickly it could slip away, how fragile even the strongest empire could be. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Some debts can't be paid with money. A.M. Vincent stared at the message, his mind racing. A.M. Alice Morgan, the waitress he'd fired on Christmas Eve. But that was impossible. She was nobody, just another struggling single mother trying to survive. Wasn't she? Vincent made a call to a private investigator he kept on retainer. "I need everything you can find on Alice Morgan. Used to work at the Velvet Room. I want her life story by tomorrow morning." He drove home through the silent city, the streets empty and cold, and for the first time in 20 years, Vincent Kane felt something close to fear. The private investigator's report arrived at dawn, delivered by encrypted email. Vincent read it in his office as weak winter light crept across the floor, and with each paragraph, the ground beneath him shifted. Alice Morgan, 34 years old, born Alice Catherine Hartwell in Greenwich, Connecticut, daughter of Richard and Catherine Hartwell. Father, founder and CEO of Hartwell Industries, a multinational conglomerate worth approximately $48 billion. Alice, only child, sole heir to the Hartwell fortune. Vincent's coffee went cold as he read. Alice had graduated from Yale with degrees in economics and business management, then spent 5 years working in her father's company, learning every aspect of the operation. She'd been groomed to take over the empire. But 8 years ago, she'd walked away from it all, married a man her family disapproved of, a musician named David Morgan, and been effectively disowned when she refused to end the relationship. David Morgan had died 3 years ago in a car accident, leaving Alice with a daughter and nothing else, or so it had seemed. But the report revealed something else. 6 months ago, Richard Hartwell had died of a heart attack. His will, contested by distant relatives, had finally been settled 2 weeks ago. Alice Morgan was now the sole owner of Hartwell Industries and its $48 billion fortune. She'd been a billionaire when Vincent fired her. She'd been serving drinks and taking orders while controlling more wealth than he could imagine. And she'd been doing it deliberately, living undercover, for reasons Vincent couldn't yet understand. He picked up his phone and called Marcus. "Find Alice Morgan. I need to talk to her. Now." "Already tried, boss. She's not at her apartment. Neighbors say she and her kid left yesterday with suitcases." Vincent felt his control slipping. What about Morgan Holdings? That's the interesting part. I did some digging. Morgan Holdings has been quietly acquiring assets in Chicago for the past 6 months. Real estate, businesses, debt instruments. And get this, 3 of your major competitors have suddenly gone quiet. Word is they've been bought out or forced out. Morgan Holdings is consolidating power. She's building her own empire. Vincent said it quietly, almost to himself. And she's using mine as raw material. What do you want me to do? Vincent thought about the text message, the careful planning, the months of preparation. Alice Morgan hadn't just stumbled into his life. She'd infiltrated it, studied it, learned its weaknesses. The waitress job had been reconnaissance, and he'd played right into her hands by firing her, by being exactly the kind of man she'd expected him to be. Set up a meeting, Vincent said. Go through official channels. Morgan Holdings to Kane Enterprises. I want to talk to her face to face. You sure that's smart? No, but it's necessary. The meeting was arranged for the following evening at a neutral location, a conference room in a downtown law office. Vincent arrived early, dressed in his best suit, flanked by David and Marcus. The room was sterile and professional, all glass and steel, with a view of the Chicago River frozen solid below. Alice Morgan arrived exactly on time, but she wasn't the exhausted waitress anymore. She wore a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than Vincent paid his staff in a month, her blonde hair styled in a sleek bob, minimal jewelry except for a watch that Vincent recognized as a vintage Patek Philippe. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd been born to wealth, who'd never really left it behind, even when she was pretending to struggle. 2 lawyers accompanied her, both carrying briefcases that suggested serious business. Alice dismissed them with a gesture, and they waited outside. She wanted this conversation to be private. Mr. Kane, she sat across from him, her expression neutral. Thank you for agreeing to meet. You lied to me. Vincent kept his voice level, professional, but anger simmered beneath. You worked for me under false pretenses. I worked for you honestly. I showed up on time, did my job, asked for nothing I wasn't owed. Alice folded her hands on the table. You're the one who made assumptions about who I was based on what I looked like. Why? Vincent leaned forward. Why the charade? Why work as a waitress when you're worth billions? For the first time, something human flickered across Alice's face. Pain, quickly masked. After my husband died, I needed to understand what it was like to live without the safety net, to know if I could survive on my own, raise my daughter without the Hartwell name protecting me. So I did. For 3 years, I worked regular jobs, paid rent, struggled with childcare and bills and all the things normal people deal with, and you chose to work for me specifically. Yes, Alice's eyes hardened. I chose you because I'd been researching Chicago's power structure, looking for opportunities to invest. Your name came up repeatedly. A man who'd built an empire through ruthlessness and intimidation, who treated people as disposable. I wanted to see for myself what kind of man you were. And what did you conclude? That you're exactly what I expected. A bully who's never had to face consequences. Alice pulled out a tablet and slid it across the table. This is what I've acquired in the past 6 months. $42 million in debt tied to your operations. Controlling interest in 3 properties you use for money laundering. Signed statements from 14 former employees detailing labor violations, harassment, and illegal activities. Vincent looked at the screen, his stomach sinking. She had enough to destroy him, not just financially, but criminally. Years in prison, everything he'd built reduced to ashes. What do you want? His voice came out rougher than he intended. I want you to understand what it feels like to be powerless. Alice took back the tablet. You fired me on Christmas Eve without a second thought, knowing I had a daughter depending on me, knowing it would devastate our holiday. You did it because you could, because in your world people like me don't matter. So this is revenge. No, this is education. Alice stood, smoothing her suit. I'm not going to destroy you, Mr. Kane. I'm going to give you a choice. You can fight me, spend the next 5 years in court, watch your empire crumble, probably end up in prison. Or you can work with me. Vincent stood as well, his mind racing. Work with you how? I'm building something new in Chicago. A business empire that operates legally, that treats workers fairly, that contributes to the community instead of bleeding it dry. I need people who understand how this city works, who have connections and experience. You could be one of those people, if you're willing to change. And if I refuse? Alice walked to the door, then paused. Then I'll bury you. Not because I hate you, Mr. Kane, but because men like you are obstacles to the world I'm trying to build." She looked back at him, and Vincent saw something in her eyes that shook him. Not anger, but disappointment. "You have 1 week to decide. After that, the offer expires." She left, her lawyers following, and Vincent stood alone in the conference room, staring at the frozen river below. Marcus and David entered cautiously. "Boss," Marcus said, "what do you want to do?" Vincent thought about his father, dying in an alley over a debt. He thought about his mother, working herself to death for minimum wage. He thought about all the Alice Morgans he'd encountered over the years. People just trying to survive. People he'd crushed without hesitation, because that's what power meant to him. "I need time to think," he said quietly. That night, Vincent drove to the south side, to the neighborhood where he'd grown up. The streets looked different now. Some blocks gentrified, others still struggling, all of it covered in dirty snow. He parked outside the apartment building where he'd lived as a kid, now boarded up and scheduled for demolition. Vincent sat in his car, engine running for heat, and confronted a truth he'd been avoiding for 20 years. He'd become exactly the kind of man who would have destroyed his younger self. He'd built an empire on the backs of people like his mother, like Alice pretending to be someone she wasn't, like everyone who'd ever been desperate enough to work for him. His phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number, but he knew who it was. Power isn't about control. It's about responsibility. Think about it. A.M. Vincent looked at the abandoned building, at the life he'd escaped, and wondered if Alice Morgan was offering him something he'd never had before, a chance at redemption. The snow fell harder, covering everything in white, and Vincent Kane began to understand that the real battle wasn't against Alice Morgan. It was against himself. Vincent spent the next 3 days in a kind of purgatory, watching his empire crack apart while he wrestled with Alice's offer. Marcus reported new problems daily. Suppliers demanding cash up front, banks suddenly scrutinizing accounts, city inspectors finding violations in properties that had passed inspection for years. Morgan Holdings was applying pressure from every direction, not enough to break him immediately, but enough to make clear that Alice could destroy him whenever she chose. On the 4th day, Vincent received a summons. Federal agents wanted to interview him about financial irregularities in his real estate holdings. David called in a panic, explaining that someone had provided the FBI with detailed records of transactions that skirted the edge of legality, or crossed it entirely. "They have everything," David said, his voice tight. "Bank records, emails, testimony from former associates. Vincent, this is serious. We're talking RICO charges, money laundering, tax evasion. You could be looking at 20 years. Vincent sat in his office, staring at the city he'd thought he owned. The federal summons lay on his desk like a death sentence. He knew who'd provided the information to the FBI. Alice Morgan had given him a week to decide, but she'd also made sure he understood the stakes. He picked up his phone and called the number she'd texted from. She answered on the second ring. "Mr. Kane, have you made a decision? I need to see you, in person, just the two of us." A pause. "There's a coffee shop on Randolph near Millennium Park, The Grind. I'll be there in an hour." Vincent drove downtown through afternoon traffic, the sky gray and heavy with the promise of more snow. The coffee shop was small and crowded, filled with tourists and office workers seeking warmth. He found Alice at a corner table, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, looking more like the waitress he'd first met than the billionaire who was dismantling his life. She'd ordered him a coffee, black, no sugar, exactly how he took it. The small gesture unsettled him. "You've been watching me for months," Vincent said, sitting down. "You know everything about me." "Not everything, but enough." Alice wrapped her hands around her own cup, steam rising between them. "I know you grew up poor. I know your father was killed over a gambling debt when you were 22. I know you built your empire by being harder and more ruthless than everyone around you. And you think you can change me." "No." Alice met his eyes. "I think you can change yourself, if you want to." Vincent laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You don't understand. In my world, weakness gets you killed. Compassion is a liability. Everything I've done, every hard choice I've made, it was necessary." "Was it necessary to fire me on Christmas Eve?" Alice's voice was quiet but sharp. "Was it necessary to humiliate me in front of my coworkers? To take away my income when you knew I had a child depending on me? What threat did I pose to your empire, Mr. Kane?" Vincent had no answer. The truth was, he'd fired Alice because she'd challenged him, because she'd dared to prioritize her daughter over his needs. He'd done it to maintain control, to remind everyone who worked for him that he was the one with power. "I've spent 3 years living as someone else," Alice continued, "working minimum wage jobs, struggling to pay rent, worrying about childcare and groceries and all the things you probably haven't thought about since you were young. And you know what I learned? That the system is rigged, that people like you, people with power, keep it rigged because it benefits you. You pay poverty wages because you can. You ignore safety violations because it's cheaper. You treat human beings as disposable because no one holds you accountable. And now you're going to hold me accountable. I'm giving you a chance to hold yourself accountable." Alice pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. "This is my offer. You transfer controlling interest in your legitimate businesses to a new entity we'll create together. You'll maintain a significant ownership stake and a management role, but you'll answer to a board that includes community representatives, labor advocates, and independent directors. Your illegal operations, the money laundering, the protection rackets, all of it. You shut them down completely. Clean break." Vincent opened the folder, scanning the documents. It was more generous than he'd expected. He wouldn't be destroyed, just transformed. But it meant giving up control, accepting oversight, becoming the kind of businessman he'd always despised. Soft, accountable, constrained by rules. "And if I agree to this, the FBI investigation goes away? I'll provide evidence that you cooperated in exposing the illegal activities of your former associates. You'll have to testify, but you won't face charges yourself. Fresh start." Vincent looked at her, this woman who'd served him drinks while secretly planning his downfall. Why? Why go to all this trouble instead of just destroying me? For the first time, Alice's composure cracked, her eyes filled with tears, though she blinked them back quickly. "Because 3 years ago, my husband was killed by a drunk driver. The driver was a man who worked for someone like you. Overworked, underpaid, pushed to the breaking point. He'd been on shift for 16 hours straight, no breaks, because his boss threatened to fire him if he complained. He fell asleep at the wheel and crossed the center line. Vincent felt something cold settle in his chest. "I'm sorry. I don't want your apology. I want you to understand that your choices have consequences. Every time you exploit a worker, every time you cut corners on safety, every time you treat people as disposable, you're setting in motion events that ripple outward. My daughter lost her father because someone like you valued profit over human life. So this is about revenge." "No." Alice wiped her eyes, her voice steadying. "This is about preventing the next tragedy. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. I could live anywhere, do anything, but I chose to come to Chicago, to work in your club, to learn how men like you operate, because I want to build something different, an economy that works for everyone, not just the people at the top." Vincent sat back, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He thought about all the people he'd employed over the years, all the corners he'd cut, all the times he'd prioritized his own power over their well-being. How many lives had he damaged? How many families had he hurt? "I don't know if I can be the person you want me to be," he said quietly. "I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to try." Alice stood, leaving the folder on the table. "You have 3 days left. After that, I move forward without you, and you face the consequences of everything you've built." She walked out of the coffee shop into the gray afternoon, and Vincent sat alone with his coffee and his choices. Around him, people laughed and talked, living normal lives, unaware that at this small table, a man's entire world was collapsing. That night, Vincent drove to the cemetery where his mother was buried. He hadn't visited in years, too busy building his empire to spare time for the dead. Her grave was simple, just a flat marker in the ground, covered with snow. Vincent brushed it clear and sat on the frozen earth, not caring about his expensive coat. "I don't know what to do, Ma," he said to the silence. "I built everything you wanted for me. Power, money, respect. But I think I did it wrong. I think I became the kind of man you would have hated." The wind picked up, carrying snow across the cemetery. Vincent thought about his mother working 3 jobs, coming home exhausted, but always finding time to help him with homework, to make sure he ate, to tell him he could be anything he wanted. She'd died when he was 30, worn out from decades of struggle, and Vincent had sworn at her grave that he'd never be poor again, never be vulnerable again. But in protecting himself, he'd become the enemy, He'd become the kind of person who created more people like his mother, desperate, exploited, ground down by a system that valued profit over humanity. Vincent's phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Boss, we need to talk. Things are falling apart fast." He looked at his mother's grave, at the name carved in stone, and made his decision. Not because Alice Morgan had forced him to, but because sitting here in the snow, he finally understood what his mother would have wanted him to be. Not powerful, not rich, just decent. Vincent stood, brushed off his coat, and walked back to his car. He had 3 days to dismantle an empire he'd spent 20 years building. It was time to get started. Vincent called Alice the next morning and said 2 words. "I'm in." They met in a conference room at Morgan Holdings' Chicago office, a sleek space in the Willis Tower with views that stretched to the horizon. Alice had assembled a team: lawyers, accountants, business consultants, and 2 people Vincent recognized as community organizers from the South Side. The message was clear. This wasn't going to be business as usual. "Before we begin," Alice said, "I need to know you understand what you're agreeing to. This isn't a cosmetic change. You'll be giving up control, accepting oversight, and fundamentally changing how you operate. There's no going back." Vincent looked around the table at the faces watching him, some skeptical, some curious, all of them waiting to see if he was serious. "I understand. Let's get to work." The next 72 hours were the most intense of Vincent's life. They started by identifying which of his businesses could be legitimized and which had to be shut down entirely. The nightclubs and restaurants could continue operating, but with new management structures, fair wages, and proper benefits for workers. The real estate holdings would be transferred to a community development corporation that would prioritize affordable housing over maximum profit. The illegal operations, the money laundering fronts, the protection rackets, the under-the-table deals, those had to end. Vincent made the calls himself, meeting with associates who'd worked for him for years, explaining that the game was over. Some understood, others threatened him. Marcus stood by his side through all of it, loyal even as the empire they'd built together came apart. "You sure about this, boss?" Marcus asked after a particularly difficult meeting with a supplier who'd been moving stolen goods through Vincent's warehouses. "No," Vincent admitted, "but I'm doing it anyway." The hardest part was facing the people he'd hurt. Alice insisted on it, said that accountability meant more than just changing business practices. It meant acknowledging damage done. So Vincent met with former employees who'd been fired unfairly, with vendors he'd squeezed for every penny, with community members whose neighborhoods had been degraded by his operations. One meeting stayed with him. A woman named Teresa, who'd worked as a cleaner in one of his nightclubs, sat across from him in a small office and told her story. She'd been injured on the job, slipped on a wet floor and hurt her back, but Vincent's management had refused to file a workers' compensation claim, threatened to fire her if she complained. She'd lived with chronic pain for 2 years, unable to afford proper medical care. "I'm sorry," Vincent said, and meant it. "That shouldn't have happened." "No, it shouldn't have." Teresa's eyes were hard. "But sorry doesn't pay my medical bills or give me back the years I spent in pain." Alice, sitting beside Vincent, spoke up. "We're establishing a victim compensation fund. It won't undo the harm, but it will provide financial support for people who were injured or exploited by Kane Enterprises' previous practices." Teresa looked between them, skeptical but listening. "Why should I believe anything will change?" "Because I'm going to make sure it does," Alice said. "And because Mr. Kane is going to be held accountable, not just by me, but by a board that includes people like you, people who've experienced the harm firsthand." They spent an hour with Teresa, documenting her case, arranging for medical care, and listening to her suggestions for how to prevent similar injuries in the future. When she left, Vincent felt exhausted and humbled. "There are dozens more like her," Alice said quietly. "People whose lives you damaged while building your empire." "I know." Vincent rubbed his face. "How do you live with it, knowing you've hurt people?" "You don't live with it. You work to make it right, and you commit to doing better." Alice stood, gathering her files. "That's all any of us can do." On the 3rd day, they finalized the restructuring. Vincent signed over controlling interest in his legitimate businesses to the new entity, Kane Morgan Community Enterprises. He would serve as chief operating officer, with a significant ownership stake, but no unilateral decision-making power. A board of directors would oversee all major decisions, with seats reserved for community representatives, workers, and independent experts. The illegal operations were shut down completely. Vincent provided the FBI with detailed information about his former activities and the activities of his associates, agreeing to testify in exchange for immunity. It meant burning bridges, making enemies, putting himself at risk, but it also meant a clean break from the life he'd been living. Marcus pulled him aside after the final signing. "Boss, some of the guys aren't happy. They're talking about you like you're a traitor." "I know." Vincent had been getting threatening messages for days. "You don't have to stick around, Marcus. This isn't the organization you signed up for." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then shook his head. "I've been with you for 15 years. I've seen you do a lot of things, some of them pretty ugly. But I've never seen you try to do the right thing before. I want to see how this turns out. It might get dangerous." "When hasn't it been dangerous?" Marcus smiled grimly. "Besides, somebody's got to watch your back." That evening, Vincent stood in his penthouse office, looking out at Chicago as the sun set behind the skyline. The city looked the same, but everything had changed. He'd given up the empire he'd spent 20 years building, accepted accountability for the harm he'd caused, and committed to a completely different way of operating. He felt lighter than he had in years, and terrified. His phone rang. "Alice, there's someone who wants to meet you." "Who?" "My daughter, Emma. She's been asking about the man who fired her mommy on Christmas Eve. I told her you and I are working together now, that you're trying to do better. She wants to see for herself." Vincent's throat tightened. "Alice, I don't think—" "Tomorrow, 10 a.m., Lincoln Park Zoo. We'll be by the lion exhibit." She hung up before he could argue. Vincent set down his phone and looked at his reflection in the darkening window. He saw a man who'd spent his life building walls, protecting himself, maintaining control, and now those walls were coming down, leaving him exposed and uncertain. But maybe that was the point. Maybe real strength wasn't about control at all. Maybe it was about being brave enough to be vulnerable, to admit mistakes, to change. The snow had stopped, and stars were appearing in the clear winter sky. Vincent thought about tomorrow, about facing a 7-year-old girl whose Christmas he'd ruined, about trying to explain why he'd done what he'd done, and who he was trying to become. It would be harder than any business negotiation, more dangerous than any deal with criminals. But Vincent Kane had never backed down from a challenge. He just hoped he was ready for this one. Lincoln Park Zoo was nearly empty on a cold January morning, just a few hardy families braving the weather to see the animals. Vincent arrived early, dressed in casual clothes that felt strange after years of wearing suits like armor. He found the lion exhibit and waited, watching the big cats pace in their enclosure, powerful and contained. Alice arrived at exactly 10 o'clock, holding the hand of a small girl bundled in a bright purple coat. Emma Morgan had her mother's blonde hair and a face full of freckles. She looked at Vincent with the kind of direct, unflinching gaze that only children possess, seeing through all pretense to the truth underneath. "Emma, this is Mr. Kane," Alice said gently. "He's the man I told you about. The one who fired you on Christmas Eve." Emma's voice was matter of fact, not accusing, just stating a fact. "Yes." Vincent crouched down to be at her eye level, something he'd never done with a child before. "I did something very wrong, Emma. I hurt your mom when she was just trying to take care of you. I'm sorry." Emma studied him for a long moment. "Mommy says you're trying to be better now." "I am, but I know that doesn't erase what I did. My daddy used to say that people make mistakes, but what matters is if they learn from them." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I miss my daddy." Vincent felt something crack open in his chest. "I bet he was a good man. He was the best." Emma wiped her eyes. "Mommy says you're going to help make sure other kids don't lose their daddies because of bad bosses. I'm going to try." Vincent looked up at Alice, who was watching with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Your mom is teaching me how." They walked through the zoo together, an unlikely trio, the billionaire heiress, her daughter, and the reformed crime boss. Emma chattered about school and her friends, occasionally asking Vincent questions that cut right to the heart of things. "Why did you want to be mean to people? Didn't you know it would hurt them? What made you decide to change?" Vincent answered as honestly as he could, explaining about fear and power, and the ways people protect themselves by hurting others. He told her about his own father, about growing up scared and poor, about building walls so high he'd forgotten what it felt like to be human. "That sounds lonely," Emma said simply. It was. Vincent realized it was true. For 20 years, he'd been surrounded by people but completely alone, trusting no one, connecting with nothing, very lonely. They stopped at the penguin exhibit, watching the birds dive and swim. Emma pressed her face against the glass, delighted by their antics. Alice stood beside Vincent, both of them watching the girl. "She's remarkable," Vincent said quietly. "She's the reason I did all of this." Alice's voice was soft. "After David died, I could have stayed in Connecticut, lived off my inheritance, given Emma every material advantage. But I wanted her to grow up understanding that privilege comes with responsibility, that having power means using it to help people, not exploit them. So you went undercover as a waitress. I wanted to understand what life was really like for people without safety nets, and I wanted Emma to see me working, struggling, making it on my own." Alice smiled slightly. She thought it was an adventure, didn't realize until recently that we're actually wealthy. How did she take it? "Better than I expected." She said, "It doesn't matter how much money we have. What matters is how we treat people." Alice looked at Vincent. "She's 7 years old, and she understands something it took you 40 years to learn." Vincent absorbed the rebuke without flinching. "I have a lot of catching up to do." They left the zoo around noon, Emma holding both their hands as they walked to the parking lot. She chattered about the animals, already planning her next visit. At Alice's car, she surprised Vincent by hugging him. "Thank you for saying sorry," she said, "and for trying to be better." Vincent felt tears prick his eyes for the first time in decades. "Thank you for giving me a chance." After they drove away, Vincent sat in his own car for a long time, processing what had just happened. A 7-year-old girl had offered him forgiveness he didn't deserve, grace he hadn't earned, and in doing so, she'd shown him what real strength looked like, not control or dominance, but compassion and courage. The next few months were a crucible. Vincent worked 18-hour days restructuring his former empire, meeting with workers and community members, learning how to operate businesses ethically. It was harder than anything he'd done before, required more creativity, more patience, more genuine human connection, but it was also more satisfying. Kane Morgan Community Enterprises became a model for responsible business practices. They paid living wages, provided comprehensive benefits, and involved workers in decision-making. The nightclubs and restaurants thrived under new management that treated staff with respect. The real estate holdings were converted to affordable housing, with tenants having a voice in how properties were maintained. Vincent testified against his former associates, providing evidence that led to multiple indictments. It made him enemies, put him at risk, required round-the-clock security for a while, but it also freed him from the web of corruption he'd been trapped in for 20 years. He met regularly with the Victim Compensation Committee, listening to stories of people he'd hurt, working to make amends where possible. It was painful and humbling, but necessary. Teresa, the cleaner who'd been injured, became an advocate for worker safety, serving on the board of directors and pushing for even stronger protections. Alice worked alongside him, not as his boss, but as his partner. They challenged each other, disagreed frequently, but shared a common vision of what business could be. Slowly, Vincent began to understand what she'd been trying to teach him, that real power came from lifting people up, not pushing them down. One evening in late spring, Vincent stood in the same spot where he'd stood on Christmas Eve, looking out at Chicago from his penthouse office, but everything looked different now. The city wasn't a chessboard where he moved pieces, but a living community where he had a role to play, not as a king, but as a contributor. His phone buzzed. A text from Alice. "Board meeting tomorrow at 9. Don't be late. And bring coffee. It's your turn." Vincent smiled. 6 months ago, the idea of taking orders from anyone would have enraged him. Now it felt right. He was part of something larger than himself, accountable to people who'd hold him to his commitments. He thought about his mother, wondered what she'd think of the man he'd become. Not the powerful crime boss she'd never lived to see, but this newer version, humbler, more human, trying to do right by the people around him. Vincent hoped she'd be proud. The next morning, he stopped at The Grind, the coffee shop where Alice had offered him a second chance. The barista recognized him now, greeted him by name. Vincent ordered coffee for the board meeting, adding extra for Teresa and the other worker representatives. As he waited, he noticed a young man at a corner table, hunched over a laptop, looking stressed and exhausted. Vincent recognized that look, the desperation of someone barely holding on, trying to make something of themselves against long odds. On impulse, Vincent walked over. "Rough morning?" The young man looked up, startled. "Just trying to get my business off the ground. It's harder than I thought." Vincent pulled out a business card, his new one, for Kane Morgan Community Enterprises. "We have a small business development program. Mentorship, microloans, resources. If you're interested, give me a call." The young man took the card, eyes widening as he read it. "Seriously?" "Seriously. Everyone deserves a fair shot." Vincent smiled. "Someone recently taught me that." He left the coffee shop and drove to the board meeting, where Alice and the others were waiting. They spent the morning reviewing quarterly reports, discussing worker concerns, planning community initiatives. It was tedious and democratic, and nothing like the unilateral power Vincent had once wielded. It was better. After the meeting, Alice pulled him aside. "Emma's having a birthday party next weekend. She wanted me to invite you." Vincent felt a warmth spread through his chest. "I'd be honored. Fair warning, it's a princess theme, and she's expecting everyone to wear costumes." "I'll find a crown." Alice laughed, and Vincent realized it was the first time he'd heard her laugh freely, without guardedness or calculation. They'd both been wearing masks for so long, her as the undercover waitress, him as the untouchable crime boss. Now they were just two people trying to build something good. The following Saturday, Vincent showed up at Alice's house in Lincoln Park wearing a plastic crown and carrying a gift. Emma squealed with delight, introducing him to her friends as Mr. Kane, who used to be mean, but is nice now. The other parents looked at him warily, until Alice explained he was her business partner, and then they relaxed into normal party conversation. Vincent found himself sitting in a backyard decorated with balloons and streamers, eating cake and watching children play. It was so far removed from his old life that it felt surreal, but it also felt real in a way nothing had for years. As the sun set and parents came to collect their children, Emma ran up to Vincent and hugged him again. "Thank you for coming, and thank you for helping my mom make the world better. Thank you for teaching me how," Vincent said, and meant it. He drove home through the spring evening, past neighborhoods he'd once seen only as territory to control, now seeing them as communities full of people with hopes and struggles and dignity. Chicago stretched out around him, beautiful and broken and full of possibility. Vincent Kane had spent 20 years building an empire of ice, cold, hard, powerful, and ultimately fragile. Now he was part of something different, something warmer and more resilient. It wasn't an empire. It was a foundation. And for the first time in his life, Vincent understood that foundations were meant to support others, not elevate yourself. That real strength came from connection, not isolation. That the measure of a man wasn't how much power he accumulated, but how much good he did with whatever power he had. The snow that had covered Chicago on Christmas Eve had long since melted, revealing the ground beneath, ready for new growth, new beginnings, new possibilities. Vincent parked outside his building and looked up at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. He thought about Alice Morgan, who'd taught him that justice didn't have to mean destruction, that accountability could lead to redemption. He thought about Emma, who'd shown him that forgiveness was possible even when it wasn't deserved. He thought about all the people he'd hurt, and the long road ahead of making amends. Vincent Kane had been a king once, ruling an empire of shadows. Now he was just a man, trying to be better, trying to build something that would last, not because it was powerful, but because it was good. It was harder this way, more uncertain, more vulnerable. It was also more human. And that, Vincent finally understood, was the whole point. If this story resonated with you, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more powerful narratives about redemption, second chances, and the courage it takes to change. Drop a comment below and let me know. Do you believe people can truly change? Or are we defined by our worst moments? I read every comment and love hearing your perspectives. Hit that like button if you want to see more stories that challenge us to be better. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.